"Take one more step and I'll have you escorted out," Logan Pierce said, his voice slicing through the velvet-lined entrance like a blade, loud enough to turn heads across the entire sidewalk as the line of well-dressed guests shifted and stared under the glow of soft gold lights, the kind of lighting designed to make people feel important the moment they stepped inside. But right now it did the opposite. It exposed everything, every glance, every judgment, every quiet assumption hanging in the air as Darius King stood still at the front of the line, hands relaxed at his sides, wearing a fitted black t-shirt, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, nothing that screamed wealth, and that was exactly the problem, because in a place like this, where exclusivity wasn't just policy but identity, appearance was currency, and Darius didn't look like what Logan believed that currency should look like. The line behind him began to murmur. A woman in heels leaned slightly to whisper to her friend. A man in a tailored suit checked his watch with exaggerated impatience, and somewhere off to the side, the faint glow of a phone camera lifted just enough to capture the moment without drawing attention, because moments like this had a way of becoming something bigger than themselves. But Darius didn't react, not yet. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't even blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, his eyes calm, steady, almost curious, as if he'd seen this exact scene play out before. Maybe not here, maybe not tonight, but enough times to recognize the rhythm of it, the setup, the quiet escalation, the unspoken script everyone else seemed eager to follow. Logan crossed his arms tighter, stepping forward just enough to close the space between them, asserting control without touching. "You're not on the list," he added, sharper this time, like repetition would make it more true, like authority lived in volume instead of facts. Darius glanced briefly toward the tablet in Logan's hand, the glowing screen reflecting off polished marble floors behind him, then back at Logan, his voice finally cutting in, low, even, controlled. "Are you sure you checked the right name?" And it wasn't a challenge, not exactly. It was something quieter, more dangerous, because it carried no emotion, no urgency, just certainty, the kind that made people uncomfortable when they weren't used to being questioned. Logan scoffed, a short dismissive sound, already turning the screen slightly as if to prove his point without actually offering proof. "I know how to read," he said, glancing over Darius's shoulder as if searching for someone more worthy of his attention. "Step aside, you're holding up the line." And that was when the pressure shifted, subtle but real, because now it wasn't just about denial, it was about removal, about making space for someone who fit the image better. Someone who didn't disrupt the narrative this place had built about itself. A tall man in a navy blazer stepped forward behind Darius, smirking slightly. "Come on, man, some of us actually belong here," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard, just quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant to sting, and a few people nearby chuckled under their breath, not loudly, not boldly, but enough to signal agreement, enough to reinforce the line being drawn right there on the sidewalk. But Darius didn't move. Not an inch. His posture didn't change, his breathing didn't shift. He stood as if anchored to the ground itself, as if the noise around him existed in a different world entirely, and for a brief second, the air tightened, because stillness like that wasn't normal, not in situations like this, not when someone was being told they didn't belong. Logan noticed it too, his jaw tightening slightly, irritation creeping into his voice. "I'm not repeating myself," he said, gesturing subtly toward the street. "You can leave, or I can have security help you make that decision." And there it was, the escalation, clean, controlled, wrapped in policy but rooted in something deeper, something older, something that had nothing to do with a guest list and everything to do with perception. A few steps away, the phone that had been raised earlier lifted higher now, its lens steady, capturing every word, every expression, every shift in tone. Because people sensed it now, this wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a moment, and moments like this had consequences. But Darius still didn't react the way they expected. Instead, he let a small breath out, almost like a quiet reset, his gaze drifting past Logan for just a second, taking in the entrance, the signage, the architecture, the subtle details most people overlooked when they were too busy trying to get inside. And for a split second, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not frustration, something else, something measured, something intentional. Then he looked back at Logan, calm as ever, and said, "Interesting," just one word, but it landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it didn't defend, didn't argue, didn't explain, it observed. And in that observation was a quiet warning no one there fully understood yet. The line had gone silent now, the murmurs fading into a Tense stillness. Even the man in the navy blazer shifted his weight slightly, uncertain for the first time, because something about Darius didn't match the role they had assigned him. Something didn't fit, and when things don't fit, people start to hesitate. Logan didn't hesitate though, not outwardly. He stepped forward again, doubling down. Last chance, he said, voice firm, controlled, you're not getting in. And for the first time, Darius smiled. Not wide, not mocking, just a small, precise curve at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that didn't belong in a moment like this unless the person wearing it knew something no one else did, and that was exactly what made it unsettling, because while everyone else saw a man being turned away, Darius King saw something else entirely, something already unfolding beneath the surface, something that had been set in motion long before he ever stepped up to that door, and he didn't need to raise his voice to prove it. Darius did not move, and that was the first crack in the illusion Logan had built around himself, because everything about this place relied on motion, on people complying, stepping forward when invited, stepping aside when dismissed, flowing like a current that never questioned where it was being directed. But Darius stood still in a way that interrupted that current, and interruptions like that made people uncomfortable. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough for everyone watching to realize this was no longer routine. Logan shifted his stance slightly, subtle, but enough to betray that something was not unfolding the way he expected. His grip tightened around the tablet as if it could anchor his authority back into place. I am done asking, he said, his tone flattening into something colder, more official, the kind of voice people used when they believed rules alone could carry weight. You need to leave now. And still, Darius did not argue, he did not plead, he did not even glance at the people behind him who were now openly watching, some curious, some impatient, some quietly recording. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not defensive, just precise, and for a moment, Logan smirked, a quick flash of satisfaction crossing his face as if this confirmed what he already believed, that Darius was about to make a call he would regret, that he was about to escalate in a way that would justify everything that had already been said. But that assumption only lasted a second, because when Darius lifted the phone to his ear, his voice did not match the situation Logan thought he was controlling. It was calm, clear, measured. Sophia, he said, not loudly, not for effect, but with a quiet authority that cut through the tension in a way volume never could. I am outside. There was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, just enough space for the person on the other end to respond, and then he added, yes, go ahead and begin verification. Logan's smirk faded just slightly, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of doubt that he quickly buried under a sharper tone. You can make all the calls you want, he said, stepping closer again. It does not change the fact that you are not getting in, and that was when something shifted again. Not in Darius, but in the people watching, because now the situation had layers. It was no longer just a man being turned away, it was a man who seemed entirely unbothered by being turned away, and that kind of confidence did not come from nowhere. The woman with the phone stepped closer, her camera now clearly pointed, no longer hiding it, capturing Logan's face, Darius's stillness, the line of guests who were now less interested in getting inside and more interested in what was about to happen next, and somewhere in that crowd, a voice spoke up. Hesitant but audible. He does not look like he is bluffing. It was quiet, almost swallowed by the air, but it landed, because uncertainty spreads faster than certainty when people are not sure what they're looking at. Logan heard it too, his jaw tightening as he glanced briefly toward the crowd before snapping his attention back to Darius, doubling down as if volume could erase doubt. Security, he called over his shoulder, not yelling, but firm enough to carry, and from just inside the entrance, a tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, his posture straight, his expression neutral, trained, the kind of presence meant to reinforce decisions without question. He stopped just beside Logan, not touching Darius, but close enough to signal what came next. And still, Darius did not react the way they expected. He did not step back, did not raise his hands, did not even acknowledge the shift in personnel. Instead, he listened, just for a second longer, then spoke again into the phone. Make sure the timestamp is logged, he said, his eyes lifting briefly to meet Logan's, not confrontational, not aggressive, just direct, and pull the entry system records from tonight. There was another pause. And then, softer, almost like a conclusion, yes. Include everything. He lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, just letting it rest in his hand, and for the first time, Logan hesitated, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough for the security guard beside him to glance sideways, just a fraction, because hesitation at the top always trickled down, even when it was small, even when it was quickly masked. Logan cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders, reasserting the version of control he believed he still had. "Last warning," he said again, but this time, the words did not land the same way. They felt rehearsed, repeated, like something being said out of obligation rather than certainty, and that difference, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. The crowd had shifted now, no longer just watching, but leaning in, waiting. The energy no longer belonged to the entrance, it belonged to the moment, and Darius, standing at the center of it, finally moved, not stepping back, not stepping forward, but lifting his gaze fully, taking in Logan, the guard, the crowd, the cameras, everything. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not harden, it stayed exactly the same, calm, controlled, almost quiet. "You keep saying I am not getting in," he said, each word placed carefully, "but that is not the question you should be asking." Logan frowned, just slightly, caught off guard by the shift. And for a brief second, the script he had been following seemed to slip out of his hands, because this was no longer about entry, it was about something else entirely, something he had not prepared for, something he could not control with a list or a rule or a raised voice. And somewhere behind him, inside the club, a faint sound echoed, a door opening, footsteps moving faster than usual, subtle, but out of rhythm with the calm luxury the space was designed to project. And that was when the first real sign appeared that whatever Darius had set in motion was already beginning to reach beyond the sidewalk, beyond the line, beyond Logan's control, and into the very system he thought he was protecting. The faint shift inside the club did not go unnoticed, not by Darius, and not by the people who had started to sense that whatever was happening at the door was no longer contained to the sidewalk. The rhythm of the night had changed, subtle but undeniable. The bass from inside still pulsed through the walls, low and controlled, but layered beneath it now was something else, movement that did not match the curated calm of exclusivity, footsteps that carried urgency instead of leisure, and Logan heard it too, even if he refused to acknowledge it. His eyes flicked toward the entrance for half a second before snapping back to Darius, doubling down on the authority he believed he still held. "This is over," he said, sharper now, his patience thinning as control slipped through his fingers in ways he could not quite explain. "You are done here," but the words landed differently now, weaker, like an echo of something that had already started to collapse, because the environment around him was no longer reinforcing his version of reality. The crowd had grown quieter, not out of obedience, but anticipation. Phones were no longer discreet, they were visible, steady, pointed directly at the unfolding moment, and that changed everything, because once something is being witnessed, it becomes harder to hide behind policy, harder to pretend that tone and language do not matter. The security guard beside Logan shifted his stance slightly, not stepping forward, not escalating, just waiting, because even he could feel it. The hesitation at the top had reached him now, and hesitation, once it spreads, is impossible to fully contain. Darius lowered his phone completely this time, the call still active but no longer the focus, his attention fully present, fully engaged, but not in the way Logan expected. There was no confrontation in his posture, no urgency in his voice, just a steady awareness of everything unfolding in real time. "You keep trying to end something that has already started," he said quietly, his words measured, almost reflective. And that sentence hung in the air longer than it should have, because it did not sound like a defense, it sounded like a statement of fact. Logan frowned, confusion breaking through his irritation for just a moment. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, the edge in his voice sharper now, less controlled. And that was the second crack, because questions like that do not come from authority, they come from uncertainty, and uncertainty, once exposed, invites everything else to unravel. Before Darius could respond, the door behind Logan opened wider this time, not the subtle shift from before, but a clear interruption. A woman stepped out quickly, mid-30s, composed but moving with purpose, her eyes scanning the scene before locking onto Darius with immediate recognition. "Mr. King," she said, her voice cutting clean through the tension, not loud, but precise, and everything stopped, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once. The crowd, the murmurs, even Logan's posture seemed to freeze in place, because names have weight, especially when spoken with certainty. Logan turned sharply, his expression tightening as he looked at her. "Sophia, this is not," he started, but she did not let him finish. "It is exactly what I think it is," she replied, stepping forward, her gaze never leaving Darius. "We have already begun internal verification," and that sentence did more damage than any raised voice could have, because it confirmed something no one there had fully understood yet. That this moment was not isolated, it was connected, documented, already moving. Through systems far beyond the front door, Logan's grip on the tablet tightened again, but this time it looked different, not like control, but like something slipping away. "There is nothing to verify," he insisted, his voice pushing harder now, trying to reclaim ground that was already shifting beneath him. "He is not on the list," and that was when Sophia finally looked at him, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with something colder, something more final. "The list is not the issue," she said, each word deliberate. "The system is," and for a moment, Logan did not understand, or maybe he did and refused to accept it, because accepting it would mean acknowledging that the authority he had been using as a shield was no longer valid, that the structure he relied on had already started to turn against him. The security guard glanced between them, uncertainty now fully visible in his posture. The crowd leaned in closer, the phone steady, capturing every second, every shift, every word, because now it was undeniable. This was no longer a simple denial at a door. This was something else entirely, something bigger, something that was unfolding in real time, and Darius, standing at the center of it, finally spoke again, his voice unchanged, calm, controlled, but carrying a clarity that cut through everything else. "You said I was not on the list," he said, looking directly at Logan, "so maybe it is time you ask why," and that question did not demand an answer, it exposed the absence of one, and in that absence, the entire dynamic began to shift, because for the first time, it was no longer Darius being evaluated, it was Logan, his decisions, his assumptions, his actions, all of it now under a different kind of scrutiny, one that did not rely on appearances or first impressions, but on facts, on records, on systems that did not forget or overlook. And as the seconds stretched, heavy with realization, the truth began to settle into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, that whatever power Logan thought he had at that door was already being rewritten somewhere else, somewhere he could not see, somewhere he could not control, and it was only a matter of time before that shift became visible to everyone standing there watching. Logan did not answer the question, not because he could not hear it, but because somewhere between the words and the silence that followed, he realized he did not have an answer that would hold up under the weight now pressing down on him. His eyes flicked once more to the tablet in his hand as if it could still provide something solid, something definitive, but the glowing screen no longer felt like proof, it felt like exposure. Sophia stepped closer to Darius, her posture no longer cautious but aligned, deliberate, and that alignment shifted the entire balance of the scene, because now it was no longer one man standing alone at the door. It was someone being acknowledged from within, someone the system itself was beginning to recognize. "We pulled the access logs from the last 30 minutes, she said, her voice steady, professional, but carrying an undertone that did not belong to routine operations. "Your name was entered, then removed," and that sentence did not just land, it echoed, because removal implied intention, and intention implied decision, and decision implied responsibility. The crowd reacted immediately, not loudly, but audibly enough, a ripple of disbelief moving through the line as people glanced at each other, phones adjusting slightly to capture reactions now as much as actions. Logan's face tightened, the first visible sign of pressure breaking through. "That is not possible," he said quickly, too quickly, the words stepping over each other. As if speed could replace certainty, "No one here would." He stopped himself, not because he wanted to, but because finishing that sentence would have required a level of confidence he no longer had. Sophia did not raise her voice, did not argue, she simply held his gaze for a moment before responding. "The system does not edit itself," and that was it, no accusation, no dramatics, just a fact placed carefully into the space between them. And facts, when delivered like that, have a way of dismantling everything built on assumption. The security guard shifted again, this time stepping half a pace back instead of forward, subtle, but enough to signal that whatever authority he had been prepared to enforce was no longer clear. The man in the navy blazer behind Darius cleared his throat, no longer smirking, his earlier confidence dissolving into something quieter, more cautious, because now the situation was no longer predictable, and unpredictability makes people reconsider where they stand. Darius remained exactly as he had been, still, composed, his presence no longer questioned but observed, and that observation carried weight, because it forced everyone around him to re-evaluate what they thought they understood. He glanced briefly at Sophia, a small nod, not for approval, not for permission, just acknowledgement. then his attention returned to Logan. "So now we know something changed," he said calmly. His tone not accusatory, not confrontational, just precise. "The question is who changed it." Logan opened his mouth, closed it again, his mind moving faster now, searching for something to hold on to, some version of events that would restore his position, but every path led back to the same place, the moment he had made a decision based on what he saw instead of what he verified, and now that moment was no longer private, it was public, documented, unfolding in real time. "This is being blown out of proportion," he finally said, forcing the words out with a steadiness he did not fully feel. Even if there was a glitch, it does not change the fact that he was not cleared for entry, and there it was, the shift from denial to justification, subtle but critical, because it meant the focus had moved from what happened to why it happened, and why always reveals more than people intend. Sophia's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Clearance is not determined at the door," she replied, each word measured. "It is determined by ownership structure and executive access," and that phrase, ownership structure, landed differently than anything else that had been said so far, because it introduced a new layer entirely, one that had nothing to do with guest lists or appearances, one that operated above the level Logan had been enforcing. The crowd leaned in again, the phone steady, capturing not just a confrontation, but a shift in hierarchy that was becoming visible in real time. Darius let a small breath out, not relief, not tension, just a quiet acknowledgement that the moment was moving exactly where it needed to go. His voice, when he spoke again, was unchanged. "You asked me to step aside," he said, looking directly at Logan, "but you never asked who I was." Logan's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no deflection, no immediate response, just a pause, a real one, the kind that happens when certainty is replaced by realization, and realization, once it arrives, cannot be undone. Inside the club, more movement now, staff gathering near the entrance, whispers spreading, screens lighting up with internal alerts that had nothing to do with the music or the night's atmosphere. Something larger was happening, something procedural, something official, and it was moving fast, faster than Logan could keep up with, faster than he could control. The woman with the phone took another step forward, her voice low but clear as she spoke into her recording. This just turned into something else. And she was right, because the moment had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about whether Darius would be allowed inside, it was about what had already been set in motion the second he arrived, the second a decision was made without verification, the second assumption replaced fact, and now, standing in front of everyone watching, that decision was being examined, not quietly, not internally, but out in the open, where it could not be ignored, where it could not be rewritten, where it would lead exactly where it was always going to lead, to the truth, and to whatever consequences came with it. The word ownership did not fade from the air, it lingered, heavy and unresolved, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the balance of attention shifted completely away from the door and onto the structure behind it, because people understood that this was no longer about access, it was about authority, real authority, the kind that did not stand outside waiting to be approved, but existed within the foundation of the place itself. Logan felt it before he could fully process it. The subtle pull of control slipping away from his grip, his posture tightened again, but this time it was not confidence, it was resistance, the kind people show when they realize they are no longer in control but refuse to accept it. "You are making assumptions," he said, his voice firmer now, almost defensive. "This is still my floor tonight, and I decide who comes in," and that statement, meant to reclaim power, instead revealed the limit of it, because it defined his authority as temporary, conditional, something granted rather than owned. Sophia did not interrupt him immediately. She let the words settle, let the crowd hear them, let Logan hear himself, and then she responded, calm, precise. "Your authority is operational," she said, "not absolute," and the distinction landed sharper than anything else, because it separated control from ownership in a way that could not be ignored. Darius watched quietly, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carried something different. Not questioned, not challenged, but recognized in a way that was beginning to make everyone else adjust their position around him. The man in the navy blazer stepped back slightly, creating space that had not been there before. The security guard lowered his hands just enough to signal that enforcement was no longer his role in this moment, and the crowd, once impatient, was now fully engaged, phone steady, eyes fixed, witnessing something that felt less like an argument and more like a shift in hierarchy unfolding in real time. "We have already escalated this to executive review," Sophia continued, her voice steady. And the system is cross-referencing ownership records as we speak. Logan shook his head, a quick motion, almost reflexive. That is unnecessary, he said, but the words lacked the authority they once carried, because necessity was no longer something he defined. The system did, and the system was already moving without him. Darius finally shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just enough movement to signal that the moment had reached a new phase. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but every word carried. You saw me, he said, looking directly at Logan, and you made a decision before you checked anything else. Logan's eyes flickered, just for a second, because that was the truth, simple, undeniable, and now impossible to avoid. That is how this started, Darius continued, not raising his voice, not pressing, just stating what was already clear, not with a system error, not with a missing name, but with a judgment, and that word, judgment, settled deeper than anything else, because it shifted the focus from process to perception, from policy to bias, and in that shift, everything else became harder to defend. The woman recording lowered her phone slightly, not because she lost interest, but because she was listening now, really listening. The moment had moved beyond spectacle into something more revealing, something that resonated beyond the sidewalk. Logan inhaled slowly, trying to regain control of his tone, his stance, his position. Even if that were true, he said, choosing his words more carefully now, it does not change the fact that access here is controlled, and there it was again, control, but now it sounded different, smaller, more limited, because the context had changed. Sophia glanced briefly toward the entrance, where more staff had gathered, their expressions uncertain, their movements restrained, waiting for direction that had not yet come. Then back to Logan. Control is only valid when it aligns with authority, she said. And right now, that alignment is being reviewed. Darius allowed a small pause after that, not to create tension, but to let it exist naturally, to let the moment breathe, because moments like this do not need to be forced, they unfold on their own when the truth is already in motion. He looked past Logan for a brief second, toward the building itself, the structure, the design, the space that everyone else saw as exclusive but he saw as something else entirely. Something built, something owned, something defined by more than a list at the door. Then his gaze returned, steady, direct. You told me I did not belong here, he said, his tone unchanged, but you never considered the possibility that you were standing in a place that belongs to me. And that sentence did not land like a declaration, it landed like a realization waiting to be accepted. The crowd reacted again, not loudly, but visibly, heads turning, expressions shifting, the weight of what was being implied settling into the space between them. Logan's grip on the tablet loosened slightly, just enough to reveal that the certainty he had been holding onto was no longer intact, and before he could respond, before he could reshape the narrative again, a soft chime echoed from inside, not music, not ambience, but a system notification, sharp, distinct, and immediately followed by a second, and then a third, screens lighting up, staff glancing down, whispers spreading faster now, because whatever was being verified, whatever was being confirmed, had just reached a point where it could no longer stay hidden behind internal processes. It was surfacing, becoming visible, becoming real, and as the sound faded into the charged silence that followed, one thing became unmistakably clear to everyone standing there watching. This was no longer a question of entry, it was a moment of revelation, and it was only just beginning. The sound of the system notifications did not fade into the background like music or conversation, it lingered, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that did not belong in a place designed to feel effortless, and that contrast made it impossible to ignore, because now the illusion of control was breaking in real time, not quietly, not behind closed doors, but out in the open where everyone could see it. Logan heard it, and this time he did not try to dismiss it. His eyes shifted toward the entrance again, longer now, searching for something he could anchor to, but what he saw only made things worse. Staff members inside were no longer moving with casual precision. They were gathering, whispering, checking devices, their attention divided between their roles and whatever alerts had just reached them, and that division of focus was enough to confirm what he had been trying to deny. The situation was no longer contained, it had spread beyond him, beyond the door, beyond the narrow authority he had been relying on. What is going on? He asked, but the question came out lower this time, less like a command and more like something he needed answered. Sophia did not respond immediately. She glanced down at her own device, the screen reflecting in her eyes for a brief second before she looked back up, and when she spoke, her tone was the same, calm, precise, but now carrying a finality that had not been there before. Verification complete, she said. And those 2 words did not need explanation, because everyone understood what they meant. The system had reached its conclusion, and that conclusion was no longer waiting to be revealed, it was already here. Logan's posture stiffened, his grip tightening again, but now it looked like resistance against something inevitable rather than control over something uncertain, and he pressed the single word sharper than before, as if forcing the answer might somehow change it. Sophia held his gaze. For a moment, not to challenge him, but to make sure there was no confusion when she spoke. Executive ownership confirmed, she said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, and the effect was immediate. The air shifted, not dramatically, not with noise or chaos, but with something deeper, something structural, the kind of shift that happens when a hidden truth becomes visible. The crowd reacted first, a wave of quiet disbelief moving through them. Not loud enough to disrupt the scene, but enough to change the energy entirely. Phones tilted slightly, capturing not just the moment but the reactions to it, because now it was undeniable. This was not speculation, not assumption, not a misunderstanding, it was fact, and facts have weight. Logan blinked once, then again, as if his mind needed time to catch up with what he had just heard. That does not make sense, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Because sense was no longer determined by his perspective, it was determined by the system, and the system had already spoken. Darius did not move, did not react with satisfaction or triumph. He simply stood there, exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, composed, as if this outcome had never been in question, because for him, it had not been. It does not have to make sense to you, he said quietly, his voice steady. It just has to be true, and that sentence settled into the moment like a final piece falling into place, because it removed interpretation entirely. It left only reality, and reality was no longer aligned with Logan's version of events. The security guard took a small step back, this time not subtle, not hesitant, but clear. His role in this moment no longer required, no longer justified. The man in the navy blazer looked away completely. His earlier confidence replaced by something closer to discomfort, because standing too close to a mistake that had just been exposed was no longer a position anyone wanted to hold. Sophia turned slightly toward the entrance, where more staff had now gathered, their attention fixed on her, waiting, and that waiting said everything, because it showed where authority had shifted, not at the door, not in the line, but within the structure itself. We are initiating immediate internal review of access control decisions made tonight, she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, not as an announcement, but as a directive, and that directive did not include Logan. It moved past him, around him, as if he were no longer the center of the system he had been representing. Logan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to reveal the pressure building beneath the surface. His eyes moved from Sophia to Darius, and for the first time, there was no dismissal, no assumption, just realization, raw and unfiltered. You should have identified yourself, he said, grasping for something, anything that could reframe what had happened. Darius met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. That was not my responsibility, he replied, calm, direct. Your responsibility was to verify before you judged, and there it was, the line that separated everything, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because it pointed directly to the moment where everything had gone wrong, not in the system, not in the process, but in the decision made before either of those were used. The crowd absorbed it, the silence that followed heavier now, not tense, but reflective, because what had just unfolded was larger than one interaction. It was familiar in a way that made people uncomfortable, in a way that made them think about other moments, other places, other times where the same pattern had played out. And now, standing in the middle of it, with cameras still recording, with the system already confirming, with authority already shifting, the truth was no longer something that could be avoided or rewritten. It was present, visible, and it was changing everything. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, heavy with everything that had just been revealed, every word, every decision, every assumption now sitting in the open where no one could pretend it had not happened. Logan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if time itself had slowed just enough to force him to experience the weight of it, his shoulders no longer squared with confidence but held in place by something else, something closer to realization. And realization has a way of stripping away the performance people rely on when they believe they are in control. The tablet in his hand no longer looked like a tool of authority, it looked like evidence, a quiet record of the moment he chose perception over verification. And around him, the environment had shifted completely. The line was no longer a line, it was an audience. The club entrance was no longer a gateway, it was a stage. And the story unfolding on it had already moved beyond his ability to shape it. Sophia took one small step forward, not dramatic, not aggressive, just enough to signal that what came next was no longer optional. "We are going to need to review your decisions from tonight," she said, her tone steady, not accusatory, but firm in a way that left no room for interpretation. And that sentence did not come with raised voices or harsh language, it came with something far more final: process, structure, consequence. Logan swallowed once, the motion subtle but visible, his eyes moving briefly to the crowd, to the phones, to the faces that were no longer neutral, no longer passive, but engaged, aware, and that awareness made everything more real, because now this was not just internal, it was witnessed, it was shared, it was something that would not disappear once the night ended. "This was a misunderstanding," he said, trying to reclaim a narrative that had already slipped beyond his reach. "The system had an error, I followed protocol," and there it was again. Protocol, the word that had carried him through the first half of this moment now sounded different, thinner, because it could not stand on its own anymore, not against what had already been confirmed. Darius listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, not dismissive, not reactive, just present, and when Logan finished, the pause that followed was not long, but it was deliberate, because what came next did not need to compete with anything, it only needed to be clear. "Protocol is not protection," Darius said, his voice calm, even. "It is a tool, and tools depend on how they are used." Logan's eyes met his again, and this time, there was no resistance, just the slow recognition of a line that had already been crossed. "You used it to justify a decision you had already made," Darius continued, not louder, not sharper, just precise, and that precision cut deeper than any raised voice could have, because it left no room for reinterpretation. The crowd absorbed it, some nodding slightly, others simply watching, but all of them understanding that this was no longer about entry or access, it was about accountability. Sophia glanced briefly at the staff gathered behind her, then back at Logan. "Your access privileges are being reviewed effective immediately," she said, and the phrasing was intentional, formal, structured, the kind of language that signaled not just a response, but a process already in motion. Logan's grip on the tablet finally loosened completely, his hand lowering slightly as if the weight of it had changed. "You are serious," he said quietly. Not a question, not really, more like a realization spoken out loud. Sophia did not hesitate. "This is already documented," she replied, and that was the final piece, because documentation meant permanence. It meant this moment was no longer contained to memory or perspective, it existed in records, in systems, in places where it could be reviewed, analyzed, and acted upon. The security guard stepped fully back now, no longer positioned as part of the interaction. His role clearly ended. The man in the navy blazer turned away completely, stepping out of the immediate space as if distancing himself from what had just been exposed, and the crowd, still watching, felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, because the outcome was no longer in question, it was unfolding, exactly as it should. Darius shifted his gaze briefly across the scene, taking in the entrance, the staff, the line, the cameras, all of it, and then back to Logan, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something quieter, something more controlled. "This was never about getting inside," he said, his voice steady. "It was about what happens when someone decides who belongs without knowing anything else." Logan exhaled slowly, the sound carrying a different weight now, not resistance, not denial, but acceptance, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue against, and in that moment, the dynamic fully reversed, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with clarity. The authority that had once stood at the door now stood in front of it, and the man who had been told he did not belong had never needed permission in the first place, because he was never outside of it to begin with. For a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from clarity, the kind that forces people to confront what they just witnessed without distraction, without noise. And in that silence, Darius's gaze drifted slightly, not away from the moment, but inward, as if the present had quietly unlocked something older, something familiar. Because this was not the first time he had stood in a space where he was told he did not belong, not the first time a decision had been made about him before a single fact was checked, and for a brief second, the sound of the city around him faded, the lights, the murmurs, the low pulse of music from inside the club, all of it softened into the background as memory took its place. He was 23 again. standing outside a glass office building in downtown Chicago, wearing his only suit at the time, a charcoal jacket that fit just slightly too tight at the shoulders, holding a portfolio he had spent weeks preparing, every page carefully printed, every detail checked and rechecked. He remembered the receptionist glancing at him, not with curiosity, not with welcome, but with the same look, the same quiet calculation that reduced him to something smaller before he had even spoken. Delivery entrance is around the back, she had said, not unkindly, not loudly, just certain. As if there was no need to verify because the conclusion had already been reached, and he remembered standing there for a moment, not reacting, not correcting her immediately, just absorbing the realization that in her mind, he had already been placed into a category that did not include possibility, that did not include ownership, that did not include anything beyond what she expected to see, and he had walked out that day without raising his voice, without arguing, because he understood something even then. Something that would shape everything that came after, that moments like that were not about the individual standing in front of him, they were about systems, patterns, decisions made long before either of them had arrived in that space, and back then, he had made a decision of his own, not to fight every moment like that with noise, but to build something that would outlast them, something that would not need permission to exist, something that would speak for itself when the time came, and now, standing here, years later, in front of a door he technically did not need to walk through. That same understanding returned, sharper, clearer, because the pattern had not changed, only the setting had. The silence broke gently as the present returned, the sounds of the street easing back in, the glow of phones, the shifting of people still watching, still processing. Logan remained where he was, but something about him had changed completely, the posture, the tone, the certainty, all of it replaced by something quieter, something more aware. And awareness has a way of altering a person even when they do not speak. Sophia glanced briefly at Darius, as if recognizing the shift in him, the moment of stillness that had passed without words, then back to the staff behind her. "We will proceed with full audit documentation," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear it, not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a process, a continuation of what had already begun. And the staff responded not with hesitation, but with movement, subtle, organized, their roles adjusting in real time to a structure that no longer revolved around Logan. The crowd, sensing the conclusion forming, did not disperse. They stayed, not out of curiosity anymore, but because what they had witnessed felt significant, something that extended beyond a single interaction, something that reflected a broader truth. The woman recording lowered her phone slightly, her voice softer now as she spoke into it. "This is bigger than the door." And she was right, because it always had been. Darius finally took a step forward, not toward the entrance, not to claim space, but simply because he could, because nothing was blocking him anymore, not physically, not structurally, not systemically, and that step, small as it was, carried more weight than anything else that had happened, because it was not forced. It was not demanded, it was simply allowed, the way it should have been from the beginning. He paused just at the threshold, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge the moment, the space, the shift that had just occurred. Then he turned slightly, his eyes meeting Logan's one last time, not with anger, not with superiority, but with something far more deliberate, something that carried both memory and meaning. "This is not the first time," he said quietly, "and it will not be the last." Logan did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already happened, and sometimes, silence is the only honest response left. Darius nodded once, a small, controlled motion, then turned back toward the entrance, the lights inside reflecting off the polished floor, the space opening in front of him without resistance, without question, exactly as it always should have. And as he stepped forward, crossing the line that had once been used to define who belonged and who did not, the moment did not end. It settled, it remained, carried by every person who had witnessed it, every camera that had recorded it, every system that had documented it, because what had just unfolded was not just a reversal of power, it was a reminder, quiet but undeniable, that dignity does not come from permission, and authority, when it is real, does not need to announce itself. It simply stands, waits, and lets the truth reveal everything else. The moment Darius crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside did not welcome him the way it welcomed others. It adjusted to him, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. The music did not change, the lighting did not shift, the conversations did not stop, yet something beneath all of that realigned, like a system correcting itself after recognizing an error it could no longer ignore. The polished floor reflected the soft gold lights above, and for a brief second, Darius paused just inside, not to take in the luxury, not to admire the design, but to register the shift, the quiet recalibration of a space that had just revealed its own flaw. Behind him, the line outside had not dissolved, it had transformed, no longer a queue waiting for approval, but a collection of witnesses processing what they had just seen, phones still raised, conversations low but intense, because moments like this do not end when the scene changes. They carry forward, they ripple, they settle into memory, into narrative, into something people repeat long after the night is over. Inside, Sophia walked beside Darius, her steps measured, her posture aligned not just with him, but with the structure now recognizing him. "We are securing all internal records from tonight," she said quietly, her voice low enough to remain private but clear enough to carry intention. "Nothing will be altered," and that statement was not reassurance. It was confirmation. The system was no longer reacting, it was preserving, documenting, ensuring that what had happened would remain intact, unedited, undeniable. Darius nodded once, not in approval, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because this was never about a single interaction, it was about the pattern behind it, the mechanism that allowed it to happen in the first place, and mechanisms do not change unless they are exposed. The bar stretched along the far wall, glasses reflecting light, conversations flowing, but even there, a few heads had turned, subtle glances, whispers beginning to spread, because information moves fast in spaces built on perception, and what had just happened at the door was already becoming part of the room's awareness, not fully understood yet, but felt, sensed, the kind of shift that people recognize before they can explain it. Darius walked forward, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just steady, each step deliberate, not to claim the space, but because the space was already his to move through. A group near the center parted slightly without being asked, not out of deference, but instinct, because presence like that changes how people position themselves, even when they do not fully understand why. Sophia glanced briefly at her device again, then back up. "Executive notifications have been sent," she added. "Board oversight is now active," and that layer, board oversight, moved everything beyond the immediate, beyond the building, into something broader, something that ensured this moment would not remain isolated, that it would be examined, understood, and addressed at a level where decisions carried long-term impact. Darius slowed slightly near the center of the room, his gaze moving across the space, not searching, not evaluating, just observing, the way someone does when they are not trying to belong, but simply exist within something they already own. And in that observation, there was no tension, no need to prove anything, because the proof had already unfolded outside, the truth had already been established, the reversal already complete. A man near the bar, mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit, leaned toward his companion, whispering something that ended with a glance toward Darius, not dismissive, not skeptical, but curious, cautious, because curiosity replaces assumption when certainty is removed. And certainty had just been dismantled at the door. Sophia stopped beside Darius, turning slightly toward him. "There will be immediate personnel reviews," she said, her tone consistent, professional, including management decisions regarding access and guest profiling, and that phrase, guest profiling, carried weight, because it named what had been implied, what had been demonstrated, what had been experienced not just tonight, but in countless other moments that never reached this level of visibility. Darius looked at her briefly, then back out across the room. His voice when he responded was quiet, but clear. "It is not just about who is removed," he said, "it is about what is corrected." Sophia nodded once, understanding the distinction, because removal addresses the result, but correction addresses the cause, and without that, nothing truly changes. The music continued, the night moved forward, but beneath it, something had shifted permanently. A layer of awareness now present in a space that had once operated on assumption, and that awareness could not be undone, because once seen, it cannot be unseen. Behind them, near the entrance, Logan remained just outside, visible through the glass, his figure no longer positioned as a gatekeeper, but as someone standing at the edge of a system that had moved past him, his posture still, his expression unreadable from a distance, but his role, unmistakably altered. Darius did not look back again, not because he was avoiding it, but because there was no need. The moment had already resolved itself, the message already delivered. Not through force, not through volume, but through presence, through truth. Through the quiet exposure of something that had always been there, just waiting to be seen. And as he continued forward, blending into a space that now moved differently because of him. One thing became clear to everyone who had witnessed even a part of it: this was not about entry, it was about recognition, and recognition, once earned, does not ask for permission, it simply exists, undeniable, unshaken, and impossible to ignore. The room continued to move, but it no longer moved the same way. The rhythm still there, the music still flowing, the conversation still weaving through the space, yet beneath it all was a subtle awareness that had not existed before, a quiet recalibration of how people looked, how they listened, how they interpreted what stood in front of them, because once a moment exposes something deeper, it changes not just what people saw, but how they chose to see going forward. Darius stood near the center of the room now, not elevated, not spotlighted, just present, and that presence carried more weight than any announcement ever could. Sophia remained a step behind and to his side, not guiding him, not leading him, but aligned with him in a way that made the shift in structure unmistakable to anyone paying attention. "Initial reports are already being compiled," she said softly, her voice controlled, professional, but layered with the momentum of something already in motion, and executive review has requested immediate recommendations. Darius nodded once, his eyes scanning the room slowly, not searching for validation, not seeking reaction, but observing the environment as it existed now, changed, adjusted, more aware than it had been minutes ago. "Then we do not delay," he replied, his voice calm, steady. "We address it while it is still visible, because visibility matters, not just for exposure, but for correction, for accountability that does not fade once attention shifts elsewhere," Sophia acknowledged, with a slight nod, already moving through the next steps in her mind, because this was no longer reactive, it was structured, deliberate, a process unfolding exactly as it should when something fundamental has been revealed. Across the room, a small cluster of guests leaned together, their conversation quiet but focused, their glances toward Darius no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but measured, thoughtful. Because understanding replaces assumption when evidence is present, and evidence had just been made impossible to ignore. One of them, a woman in a tailored blazer, straightened slightly, her posture shifting from relaxed to attentive, as if she recognized that this was not just another night, not just another scene, but something that would be remembered, referenced, discussed long after the music stopped. Darius took a slow step forward, then another, not moving toward anything specific, just allowing the space to open around him, because it did now, naturally, without resistance, and that openness was not granted, it was corrected, the result of a system that had just adjusted itself under pressure. Sophia glanced once more at her device, then spoke again. "Board oversight is requesting direct input from you," she said, her tone unchanged. "They want to understand how this should be handled moving forward." Darius paused, not because he needed time to think, but because he understood the weight of that question. Not just for tonight, but for everything that would follow. "We handle it with clarity," he said, each word deliberate, not reaction, because reaction is temporary, but clarity creates structure, it defines what is acceptable, what is not, and how those lines are enforced going forward. Sophia nodded, already translating that into action, into process, into something that would move beyond conversation into implementation. Near the bar, a staff member adjusted his stance, his attention shifting fully toward Darius now, not out of obligation, but recognition, because authority, when real, does not need to be announced, it is understood, and that understanding had begun to spread through the room in a way no instruction could have achieved. Behind them, near the entrance, the space that had once been a point of tension now stood quiet, the door opening and closing as guests entered, but the energy there was different, measured, aware, as if the threshold itself had learned something, had absorbed the moment that unfolded. Just outside it, Darius did not look back, but he did not need to, because the impact of what had happened there had already moved forward with him, embedded in the space, in the people, in the systems now actively processing it. Sophia stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice just enough to keep it between them. "There will be questions," she said, not as a warning, but as a fact, externally as well. Darius allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. "Then we answer them," he replied, with the truth, because truth does not require defense, it requires consistency, it requires the same clarity that had just exposed everything at the door, the same steadiness that had carried him through the entire moment without raising his voice, without needing to prove anything beyond what was already evident. The music shifted slightly, the next track blending in, the night continuing, but the room was not the same, it could not be, because once something has been revealed, it becomes part of the foundation, part of how everything else is built moving forward. A man approached slowly from the side, his expression careful, respectful, not intrusive. "Mr. King," he said, his tone measured, "I just want to say, that was handled with a level of composure I do not think most people could manage." Darius turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement without leaning into it. "Composure is not about the moment," he said calmly. "It is about what you carry into it, and..." That answer, simple as it was, carried more meaning than the compliment itself, because it spoke to something deeper, something that extended beyond this night, beyond this space, beyond this single interaction. The man nodded, stepping back, understanding that this was not a moment for praise, but for reflection, for recognition of something larger than what had just occurred. Sophia watched the exchange quietly, then shifted her attention back to the broader process already unfolding, the staff, the systems, the reports, all of it moving in alignment now, no longer fragmented, no longer reactive, but structured, deliberate. And as Darius continued to stand within the space that had once questioned him, now fully adjusted around his presence, one thing became unmistakably clear: this was not just a reversal of power, it was a redefinition of it, not loud, not forced, but precise, controlled, and rooted in something far more lasting than a moment at the door, something that would remain long after the night itself had faded into memory. The shift did not stop at recognition, it continued into structure, into consequence, into something that could no longer be undone by time or forgotten by distraction, because once authority has been redefined in front of witnesses, it demands alignment, and alignment was already happening in real time. Sophia's device lit again, a quiet signal that the next phase had begun. She glanced down briefly, then back up. Her voice steady, precise. "Executive directive has been issued," she said, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried across the immediate space. "All access control decisions made tonight are under formal review, effective immediately." And that statement did not create chaos, it created order, the kind that follows exposure, the kind that replaces uncertainty with structure. Staff members who had been observing from a distance now moved with intention, not rushing, not panicking, but adjusting, recalibrating their roles to align with a system that had just corrected itself. Darius remained still for a moment, not to pause the moment, but to let it settle, because this part was not about reaction, it was about resolution, the quiet implementation of what had already been revealed. Across the room, conversations had shifted again, no longer centered on curiosity, but on understanding. People were no longer asking what happened, they were beginning to understand why it mattered. And that difference is where real change begins. Sophia stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation between them while still moving forward. "The board is requesting immediate personnel action recommendations," she said, her tone unchanged, professional, but carrying the weight of authority that now extended far beyond the building. "They want to move quickly." Darius nodded once, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, not because the moment lacked significance, but because he understood exactly what it required. "Then we move with clarity," he said, his voice calm, controlled, not to make an example, but to set a standard, because examples can be dismissed, but standards redefine behavior, they reshape systems, they prevent repetition. Sophia acknowledged with a slight nod, already processing the distinction, translating it into action, into language that would carry through reports, through decisions, through the structure that would follow. Near the entrance, the space where everything had begun remained visible through the glass, but it no longer held tension, it held reflection. Logan stood there still, but not in the same way as before, not as a gatekeeper, not as a figure of authority, but as someone positioned at the edge of consequence, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just still, as if the weight of realization had anchored him in place. And realization, once fully understood, does not allow escape. It demands acknowledgement. Darius did not look toward him, but he was aware of him, aware of the role he had played in the moment, aware of what that role now represented, not as an individual failure, but as a reflection of something larger, something that required correction beyond a single person. Sophia turned slightly toward the staff behind her, her voice firm, structured. "Prepare immediate suspension of access privileges for all personnel involved in an authorized access modification," she said, each word precise, deliberate, and the response was immediate, not emotional, not reactive, but procedural, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about implementation. The system was aligning itself with the truth that had been revealed. Darius exhaled slowly, not out of relief, not out of tension, but but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its next phase, the phase where action replaces exposure, where systems adjust to prevent what had just occurred from happening again. He glanced briefly across the room, taking in the space as it existed now, different, more aware, more aligned, and that awareness would not fade because it had been earned through visibility, through truth, through a moment that could not be dismissed or ignored. A staff member approached cautiously, his posture respectful, his tone measured. "Sir, the internal audit team is ready to proceed with your input," he said, not as a request, but as a continuation of the process already in motion. Darius turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement without hesitation. "Then we proceed," he replied, his voice steady, because this was never about delay, never about waiting. It was about addressing what had been revealed while it was still clear, still undeniable. Sophia moved in alignment, already coordinating the next steps, ensuring that nothing was overlooked, nothing was minimized, because moments like this lose their impact only when they are not followed through, when they are allowed to fade instead of being reinforced. But this moment was not fading, it was expanding, embedding itself into the structure, into the policies, into the expectations that would define everything moving forward. Near the center of the room, the same guests who had watched the situation unfold now stood differently, their posture, their expressions, their awareness all shifted, because they had not just witnessed a moment of tension, they had witnessed a moment of truth, and truth, once seen, changes how people carry themselves, how they respond, how they recognize what matters. Darius remained composed, present, not elevated above the space, but fully integrated within it, because that is what real authority does. It does not isolate, it aligns, it does not demand attention, it commands understanding. And as the system continued to adjust around him, as decisions were made, as processes were activated, as structure replaced assumption, one thing became clear to everyone who had seen even a part of it: this was not just a correction of a mistake, it was a redefinition of how that mistake could never happen again. And that kind of change does not come from noise, it comes from clarity, from presence, from a moment where the truth is allowed to stand long enough to reshape everything around it. The movement of the room did not slow, but it changed direction, no longer orbiting around exclusivity, no longer driven by appearance or assumption, but quietly aligning itself with something more grounded, more deliberate, as if the space itself had recalibrated its center of gravity. And at that center stood Darius, not elevated, not spotlighted, but undeniable, his presence no longer questioned, no longer filtered through perception, but recognized for what it was, and that recognition carried through every layer of the environment, from the staff now moving with purpose to the guests whose conversations had shifted from curiosity to reflection. Sophia stood beside him, her posture steady, her attention already moving across multiple layers of execution. "Audit teams are logging every interaction tied to access decisions tonight," she said, her voice calm but precise, including verbal exchanges, and that detail mattered, because it meant this was not just about actions, but about language, about tone, about the subtle cues that reveal more than policies ever could. Darius nodded once, his gaze steady, absorbing the structure forming around the moment, because structure is what turns exposure into change. Without it, moments fade, but with it, they transform into standards, into expectations that outlast the moment itself. "Make sure context is preserved," he said quietly, "not just outcomes, because context is where truth lives. It is what separates a mistake from a pattern, an incident from a system." Sophia acknowledged immediately, already translating that into directive language, ensuring that nothing would be reduced, nothing simplified, because this was not a moment that could afford to lose its depth. Across the room, a subtle shift continued to ripple outward. Guests who had once measured each other by appearance now carried themselves differently, their awareness sharpened, their assumptions quieter, because what they had witnessed could not be unseen. And once perception is challenged like that, it does not easily return to what it was before. Near the bar, the same man who had spoken earlier now stood in silence, his posture thoughtful, as if replaying the moment in his mind, not for entertainment, but for understanding, because understanding requires reflection, and reflection had just been forced into the room without warning. Sophia's device lit again, another update, another layer of process unfolding. She glanced at it briefly before speaking. "Preliminary recommendations are being requested for immediate enforcement," she said, her tone unchanged, but the weight of the words clear. This was no longer about reviewing what happened, it was about defining what would happen next. Darius exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed but intentional. "Then we define it clearly," he said, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, because ambiguity allows patterns to repeat, it creates space for bias to hide behind procedure, and that space had just been exposed as unacceptable. Sophia nodded, already structuring the framework in her mind. Policies that would not just address the visible moment, but the underlying mechanism that allowed it to occur, behind them. Through the glass, Logan remained in place, but the distance between him and the space inside felt greater now, not physical, but structural, as if the system itself had drawn a line that no longer included him in its center, and that line was not drawn with emotion, it was drawn with clarity, with process, with consequence. Darius did not turn toward him, but the awareness remained, not personal, not directed, just present. Because this was never about one person, it was about what that person represented in the moment, the decision, the assumption, the failure to verify, all of it part of something larger that now had to be corrected. Sophia turned slightly, addressing a small group of senior staff who had gathered within earshot, her voice firm, structured, effective immediately. All access verification must include system confirmation before any decision is made, she said, each word deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation, no exceptions, and that phrase, no exceptions, carried weight because it removed discretion from the equation. It replaced assumption with requirement, and that shift was where real change begins. The staff responded with quiet acknowledgement, not resistance, not hesitation, because the authority behind the directive was now clear, unmistakable, and rooted in something that could not be challenged. Darius stepped forward slightly, not to lead, not to command, but to align himself with the process now unfolding, his presence reinforcing what had been said without needing to repeat it. A woman near the center of the room, who had been watching from the beginning, lowered her phone completely now, her expression thoughtful, almost reflective. That is how it should have been from the start, she murmured, not to anyone in particular, but the words carried, because they were not just about this moment, they were about every similar moment that had never been corrected, never been exposed, never been addressed, until now. Sophia's attention returned to Darius. Implementation will begin tonight, she said, her voice steady, no delays, and that finality marked the transition from exposure to resolution, from moment to movement, because once something is defined clearly, it demands action, it demands follow-through, it demands consistency. Darius nodded once more, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, because this was never about the moment itself, it was about what the moment revealed, and what that revelation required moving forward. The music continued, the lights remained soft, the space retained its outward appearance, but beneath it, everything had shifted, every layer now aligned with a truth that could no longer be ignored. And as the process moved forward, as systems adjusted, as standards were set in place where assumptions once stood, one thing became undeniable. This was not just a correction, it was a reset, quiet, precise, and lasting, the kind that does not fade when the night ends, but remains, shaping every moment that follows, ensuring that what had just happened would not need to happen again. The night did not end with applause, it did not close with a dramatic shift in music or a sudden change in lighting, it continued exactly as it had before, but everything beneath it had been rewritten, quietly, precisely, in a way that no one present would be able to ignore once they stepped away from it, because what had unfolded was not an interruption, it was a correction, and corrections do not announce themselves. They settle into place and redefine everything that follows. Darius stood for a moment longer at the center of the room, not to hold attention, not to claim anything, but to allow the process now unfolding around him to complete its first cycle, the staff moving with clarity, the systems aligning with verified truth, the structure no longer dependent on perception but grounded in fact. Sophia remained beside him, her presence steady, her focus already extending beyond the immediate, into reports, into implementation, into the layers of accountability that would ensure this moment did not fade into memory without leaving a mark. All directives are active, she said quietly, her voice calm but final. There is no rollback, and that phrase carried weight, because it meant what had just been set in motion would not be undone by convenience, by discomfort, or by time. It would remain integrated into the way this place operated from this point forward. Darius nodded once, not in satisfaction, not in closure, but in acknowledgement of what had been achieved, not a victory, not a confrontation, but a recalibration, the kind that does not elevate one person above another, but brings a system back into alignment with what it should have been all along. Across the room, conversations had softened, not because interest had faded, but because understanding had taken its place. People no longer needed to speculate, They had seen enough, heard enough, felt enough to carry the meaning with them without needing to repeat it out loud. Near the entrance, the glass doors reflected the street outside, the same line now moving normally, guests entering without hesitation, without tension, the threshold no longer acting as a filter of perception, but as a passage aligned with structure, and that change, subtle as it appeared, was the result of everything that had just occurred. Logan was no longer there, not because he had been removed in spectacle, but because the system had already moved past him, his absence not dramatic, but definitive, a quiet indication that roles built on assumption do not survive when exposed to truth. Darius finally shifted his stance, turning slightly toward Sophia, his voice steady, measured. "Make sure this does not become a story about me," he said, not as a request, but as a directive rooted in understanding. It needs to remain about what changed. Because personalizing moments like this reduces them, it narrows their impact, but keeping the focus on the system ensures the change extends beyond the individual. Sophia nodded immediately, recognizing the intent. "It will be documented as a structural correction," she replied, her tone precise, aligned with the principle he had just set, and that alignment ensured that the narrative would not drift, would not be diluted, would remain anchored in the truth of what had actually happened. A quiet shift in the music signaled the progression of the night, but the room no longer felt the same. It carried a different weight now, not heavier, but more grounded, more aware, as if the space itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Darius took a final look across the room, not searching, not evaluating, just observing the result of a moment that had begun with a single assumption and ended with a complete realignment of structure, and in that observation, there was no need for further action, no need for reinforcement, because the process was already in motion, already embedded, already shaping what would come next. He began to walk, not toward the center, not toward the spotlight, but through the space naturally, the way someone does when they are not trying to prove belonging, but simply exist within what is already theirs. Sophia remained in step, not leading, not following, but aligned, ensuring that every layer of execution continued as intended, and as they moved, the room adjusted around them without effort, without resistance, because it had already been corrected, already been brought into alignment with something deeper than perception, something more lasting than a single moment. Near the edge of the room, the woman who had been recording earlier lowered her phone completely, her expression thoughtful, reflective, as if she understood that what she had captured was not just a moment, but a message, something that would carry beyond this place, beyond this night, into conversations, into awareness, into change, and that is where the true impact of moments like this lives, not in the immediate reaction, but in what they leave behind. Darius did not look back, not because he was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left to prove. The moment had done its work, the system had responded, the structure had shifted, and the message had been delivered without a single raised voice, without a single demand, only through presence, through clarity, through the refusal to accept a judgment that had never been verified. And as he moved forward, blending into the space that now reflected a different standard, one thing remained clear, not just to those who had witnessed it, but to the system itself. You can deny access, you can question appearance, you can rely on assumption for a moment, but truth does not argue, it does not force, it waits, and when it reveals itself, it does not just change the outcome, it changes the rules entirely.